Welcome to After TV with your host, Andrew Keane. Today on After TV, a show that maps out the future of media through interviews with the visionaries of today, Andrew speaks with Marta Dyczok, fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars.
Hello from After TV, the show about media technology and culture. Today we are moving eastwards, or perhaps westwards, depending how you look at it. We're going to Ukraine, or we're going at least metaphorically to Ukraine, to talk to an expert on Ukraine, a woman called Marta Dyczok. I hope I got your name right, Marta,
right.
Who is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Hi, Marta.
Hello, Andrew. Nice to talk to you.
Did I get your name right?
You did indeed.
Good. Well, thank you. So, Marta, before we talk about media in Ukraine, for our listeners who perhaps are not too familiar with it, tell us a little bit about its geography and history and culture.
Ukraine has been part of the Soviet Union and before that the Russian Empire, and so many people have not actually heard of Ukraine until very recently, even though it's a very old place. It's located between Russia and Poland, just north of the Black Sea, so it's just north of Turkey. So it sits right on the border of Europe and Asia. As I said, it's a very old place, which is now going through a period of rapid transition and modernization, unlike anything that it's ever experienced before.
What kind of size geographically?
Oh, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. It's larger than France in terms of physical space. The population is just under 50 million.
So it's a pretty big place with a lot of people. And what is it about? I guess it's about the size of California, or a little bigger.
My American geography isn't that
Right.
great, so I could compare it to France, but I'm not. It's not quite as big as Texas.
And what are its largest cities?
The capital city is Kyiv, which is spelled K-Y-I-V and a little hard to pronounce. That's the city of the Golden Domes. So if you're thinking of traveling, that's the city I would start with. There's also the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, which is a nice kind of Habsburg city, and then Odessa and Yalta on the Black Sea, which are port cities and resort towns. And then, of course, there's the industrial heartland where cities like Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk are, which is where a lot of coal and steel are produced, and that's where the industry is located. So it's a pretty diverse country.
And presumably the bulk of its economy is still focused on heavy industry, is it?
It's been shifting. It was overwhelmingly heavy industry and agriculture in the communist period, but over the last 15 years it's been shifting to light and medium industry and a lot of services. So it's really, the economy is very much in transition.
Great, as of course media is. So before we talk about contemporary media in Ukraine, please talk to me a little bit about the nature of media in Ukraine during the Soviet Union, during the totalitarian or so-called totalitarian period of communism.
When Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, we didn't really know what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, whether it was in politics, media, economics. It was this sort of gray zone that most people knew very little about, because the Soviet Union went to a lot of trouble to block information coming out of the Soviet Union and going into the Soviet Union. And there was this perception that the Communist Party was all-powerful because it owned the economy, it controlled all the media outlets, it engaged in censorship, and it tried to create this new Soviet man, the Homo Sovieticus. And it was really difficult to know to what degree they were actually successful. What we saw in 1989-91 is that the Communist Party didn't actually manage to convince people to buy into the communist ideology. When people had the option of choosing, everybody chose to eliminate the communist system. So the media as a propaganda instrument failed in its major role during the communist period, but we didn't know that until everything started collapsing. There was a perception that the media was all powerful and brainwashing everybody, the same way that we don't really know what's happening in North Korea now. I mean, it's a very similar thing that we think that maybe all those people are being brainwashed, whereas in fact we don't know. China's another example where the state controls the media, but there's a lot more access to China now, and we see that a lot of the values of the communist system are not as deeply rooted as one might think.
So what you're saying then is that while the state controlled the media, the television, the newspapers, the books, presumably people just didn't take it very seriously.
Well, this is the part that we're trying to figure out to what degree they actually accepted the ideas that were being proposed to them and to what degree they were skeptical. And because there was such a discrepancy between the promises of the communist system and what was actually delivered, there was a lot of distrust towards the communist authorities and the Communist Party. And that skepticism, I think, is how we can understand what was going on in the media sector. A lot of people talk about reading between the lines, that in Ukraine and as the rest of the Soviet Union, you would read the newspapers that were communist papers, but you would learn how to find the truth that was kind of in between what was being officially said. So people learned how to sort of pull the truth out even though it wasn't being presented to them. And so in many ways, audiences in Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries now are more sophisticated because they don't buy into the messages the same way that societies in democratic countries do. That people tend to believe what they see on television and read in newspapers in a way in these developed democracies that people in post-communist countries are much more skeptical towards the media, towards their politicians, and there's a good side and a bad side to that, because when there's no trust in politicians, then it's very difficult to actually, build a political system that functions properly.
Would it be fair to say that the media in Ukraine was doubly distrusted because on the one hand it represented an alien ideology, and on the other hand it also represented an alien culture, given the fact that the Soviet Union was a Russian empire? I mean, in other words, my question would be, in the Soviet period, to what extent was Ukrainian media Ukrainian as opposed to Russian?
That's an excellent question. Russification on a level of linguistics and culture and politics was pervasive. But the Soviet Union was a curious creature in that it also had a nationalities policy. So it was a federal system, and it had an Estonian Republic and an Uzbek Republic and a Ukrainian Republic. So all of these non-Russian republics, they had not only their own parliaments but also their own media systems, which were subordinated to the central ones. During the communist period, these national media systems were not as well funded as the central ones. So you had sort of structural equality, but in fact, the media, the Ukrainian television was much less interesting. The better journalists tended to go work in Moscow in the central media. And that actually contributed to the perception that Ukrainian media is not as good as Russian media, interestingly enough. And that still lingers to a certain degree today. And the ideology, it's difficult to sort of separate how much of the ideas were accepted and how much were rejected, because the politics were clearly rejected, but some of the socioeconomic ideas actually were taken on board, and we see this in the post-communist period where a lot of people miss the security of the state giving them a job and providing them with housing. So some of the ideas were taken on board and some of them weren't, and I think that's the challenge, is to kind of separate.
And presumably also some people might miss the certainties of media.
I'm sorry?
Some people might miss the certainties of media.
Well, the media was not very well, it wasn't trusted in the communist period. So I don't know if I would agree with that.